She promised to return, but it took 29 years. The lion waited every single one of them. The morning of October 17, 2024, began like any other Thursday at the Portland Wildlife Sanctuary in Oregon. Mist rolled in from the Columbia River, wrapping the 200-acre facility in a blanket of gray that would burn off by noon. Kevin Matthews, head of security, made his usual rounds at 6:47 a.m., coffee in hand, checking perimeter fences and electronic locks with the kind of muscle memory that comes from doing the same job for 14 years. Everything was secure. Everything was normal. Everything was about to change in a way that would challenge everything scientists thought they knew about memory, loyalty, and the emotional capacity of apex predators. At 7:15 a.m., the morning feeding crew arrived. Sarah Chen, a wildlife keeper who had worked at the sanctuary for 8 years, approached the large cat enclosure in Sector D with her usual cart of prepared meals. She had fed Aslan, the sanctuary's oldest African lion, hundreds of times. She knew his routine, she knew his temperament. She knew that at 31 years old he was a living anomaly, a statistical impossibility, one of the oldest lions in captivity in the entire Western Hemisphere. What she didn't know was that Aslan hadn't eaten in 3 days. The 520-pound lion, his once golden mane now streaked heavily with white and grey, had been pacing his enclosure for 72 hours straight. Night shift workers had noted it in their logs, but attributed it to arthritis or digestive issues common in geriatric big cats. But Aslan wasn't in pain. He was waiting. He was sensing something that humans, with all their technology and instruments, couldn't detect. Someone was coming. Someone he had waited 29 years to see again. Margaret Rose Sullivan was 79 years old and dying. The doctors at Oregon Health and Science University had been clear about this 3 weeks earlier when the latest scans came back. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer metastasized to her liver and lungs. 3 to 6 months, they said, maybe less. No treatment options that would do anything except make her remaining time more miserable. Margaret had taken the news with the kind of stoic grace that defined her entire life. She had thanked the doctors, scheduled one more appointment for pain management, and then went home to her small cottage in Gresham to make a list. Not a bucket list of exotic destinations or adrenaline-fueled adventures. Margaret had never been that kind of person. Her list had exactly 3 items written in her careful, shaking handwriting. Number 1, call my daughter in Boston and tell her I love her. Number 2, donate my veterinary library to the university. Number 3, go back to the sanctuary and keep the promise I made 29 years ago. That 3rd item had haunted her for nearly 3 decades. It had lived in the back of her mind through her husband's death, through her own battle with breast cancer in her 60s, through countless sleepless nights when guilt wrapped around her chest like a vice. She had promised him she would come back. She had looked into those amber eyes, barely 2 months old, clouded with fear and confusion, and she had whispered the words, while tears streamed down her 50-year-old face. I will come back for you. I promise, my sweet boy. Mama promises. But she hadn't gone back. Life happened. Responsibilities happened. Fear happened. The fear that he would have forgotten her, that her return would be selfish, that it would be easier for both of them if she just stayed away. But now, with death's timeline firmly established, Margaret Rose Sullivan had no more time for fear. The phone call to the Portland Wildlife Sanctuary was answered on the 3rd ring by a cheerful administrative assistant named Brittany, who clearly had no idea what to do with an elderly woman asking if a specific lion was still alive. Please hold, the young woman said, her voice uncertain. Let me transfer you to Dr. Patel, our Director of Veterinary Services. Dr. Rajesh Patel had been the head veterinarian at Portland Wildlife Sanctuary for 6 years. He was a serious man, trained at Cornell, with 15 years of experience working with exotic animals. He had seen nearly everything in his career. But when the call was transferred to his office and he heard the trembling voice on the other end say, I'm calling about Aslan, the lion in Sector D. I need to know if he's still alive. Something in her tone made him pull up the database before responding. Yes, Dr. Patel said slowly, reviewing the file on his screen. Aslan is still with us. He's 31 years old, which is remarkably old, for an African lion. May I ask your connection to him? There was a long pause on the line. Dr. Patel could hear breathing, shaky and emotional. My name is Dr. Margaret Sullivan, the woman finally said. I was a wildlife veterinarian in Oregon for 34 years before I retired. In 1995, I was the emergency contact when a 6-week-old lion cub was confiscated from an illegal exotic pet situation in Eugene. His mother had died. He was hypothermic, dehydrated, and given less than a 10% chance of survival. I took him home and cared for him for 9 months until he was strong enough and old enough to be placed in permanent sanctuary care. I brought him to your facility in June of 1996. Dr. Patel sat up straighter in his chair, his fingers flying across the keyboard to access the deeper historical records. The older files, the ones from before the sanctuary had digitized everything, existed only as scanned PDFs of handwritten intake forms. And there it was, June 14, 1996. African lion, male, approximately 11 months old. Surrendered by Dr. Margaret R. Sullivan, licensed wildlife veterinarian. Animal named Aslan. Notes indicate unusually strong human bonding due to extended hand-rearing period. Recommend minimal human contact during acclimation to prevent separation distress. Dr. Sullivan, Dr. Patel said quietly, and his voice had changed completely, shifting from professional courtesy to something approaching reverence. You're the one who saved him. Yes, Margaret whispered, and now she was crying openly. And I promised him I would visit. But I never did. I got scared. I thought he would have forgotten me and that seeing me would just confuse him or upset him. But I'm dying, Dr. Patel. I have maybe 3 months. And I can't die without keeping my promise to him. I need to know if I can come see him. Just once, just to say goodbye. There were protocols for this kind of thing, strict protocols. The sanctuary didn't allow direct contact between visitors and the large cats. Insurance liability, safety regulations, state wildlife laws. Dr. Patel should have explained all of this, should have offered a compromise, perhaps a viewing from a safe distance. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the desperate grief in the old woman's voice. Maybe it was the unprecedented nature of the situation. Or maybe it was the notation he was reading in Aslan's behavioral file, a note added just that morning by Sarah Chen. Aslan has been exhibiting unusual behavior for 72 hours. Constant pacing, refusal to eat, vocalizations inconsistent with distress or illness, cause unknown. Dr. Sullivan, Dr. Patel heard himself saying, "When can you come to the sanctuary?" Margaret arrived at the Portland Wildlife Sanctuary at 10:30 a.m. on October 17th. She drove herself, despite her daughter's protests during their phone call the night before. Despite the pain medication that made her drowsy. Despite hands that shook so badly she could barely grip the steering wheel. She arrived wearing a blue cardigan over a floral dress, clothes she had spent 40 minutes that morning working up the strength to put on. She leaned heavily on a wooden cane, a gift from her late husband Robert, worn smooth by years of use. And she carried with her a small cloth bag containing items she had kept for 29 years in a cedar chest in her attic. A baby blanket, pale yellow and threadbare. A small stuffed lion toy, its mane matted from being carried in the mouth of a real lion cub. And a photograph, creased and faded, of a younger version of herself holding a tiny golden bundle of fur against her chest. Dr. Patel met her at the main entrance personally. He was a tall man with kind eyes, and he took one look at Margaret's frail frame and immediately offered a wheelchair. Margaret refused with a gentle but firm shake of her head. "I need to walk to him," she said simply. "I left on my own 2 feet. I need to return the same way." The walk from the administrative building to Sector D took 12 minutes at Margaret's pace. Dr. Patel matched her stride, not rushing, explaining quietly that they would need to assess the situation carefully. That Aslan was elderly and could be unpredictable, that they would have several safety officers present. Margaret listened to all of this and nodded, but Dr. Patel could see that nothing he said was going to change her mind. She was going to see that lion if it was the last thing she did, and both of them suspected it might be. Aslan knew she was coming before any human at the sanctuary did. At 10:04 a.m., a full 26 minutes before Margaret's car pulled into the visitor parking lot, the massive lion had stopped his relentless pacing and moved to the front corner of his enclosure, the corner that faced the main pathway from the administrative building. He sat down, his arthritic joints protesting, but his posture alert and focused. Sarah Chen, who was nearby preparing afternoon enrichment activities, noticed immediately. She had never seen Aslan position himself that way. For 8 years, he had been a lion who preferred the back corners of his space, who avoided the viewing areas where visitors might gather, but now he sat like a statue, his clouded eyes fixed on a point in the distance, his nostrils flaring with each breath as if trying to capture something on the wind. When Dr. Patel radioed ahead to inform the Sector D team that they were bringing Dr. Sullivan for a visit, Sarah's response was immediate and shocked. "Sir," she said, her voice crackling through the radio, "I think Aslan already knows. He's been sitting at the front of the enclosure for 20 minutes. He hasn't moved. He's just waiting." The scientific literature on long-term memory in big cats was limited and largely inconclusive. Most studies suggested that lions could remember individuals for perhaps 18 months to 3 years, possibly longer if the association was reinforced regularly. But 29 years. 29 years without a single interaction, without a single reinforcement of the bond. That wasn't just unprecedented. It was, according to every animal behaviorist Dr. Patel had consulted in frantic phone calls that morning, functionally impossible. The olfactory memory of mammals, even those with sophisticated scent detection like lions, simply didn't work that way over such an extended period. Neural pathways that weren't regularly activated would degrade, would be overwritten by more recent and relevant memories. That was basic neuroscience, but Dr. Patel was about to learn that there were some things that transcended basic neuroscience, some bonds that rewrote the rules entirely. Margaret heard him before she saw him. They were still 50 yards from the enclosure, making their way slowly along the paved path, when a sound cut through the morning air that made everyone stop. It wasn't a roar. Every staff member at the sanctuary knew what Aslan's roar sounded like. That deep, chest-rumbling sound that could carry for miles. The sound that reminded everyone that despite his age, he was still very much an apex predator. This was different. It was a vocalization that Sarah Chen, with 8 years of experience, had never heard Aslan make. It was almost like a chuffing sound, but deeper, more sustained. It was the kind of sound a lion might make to greet another lion in its pride. A sound of recognition. A sound of welcome. A sound that, according to all the literature Sarah had ever read, adult male lions rarely if ever made toward humans. Margaret stopped walking. Her hand tightened on her cane until her knuckles went white. Her other hand came up to cover her mouth, and tears immediately began streaming down her weathered cheeks. "He remembers," she whispered. "Oh God, he remembers me." Dr. Patel exchanged a glance with Sarah Chen. Both of them had chills running down their arms. They continued forward, and with each step Aslan's vocalizations increased in frequency and intensity. By the time they reached the observation area, adjacent to his enclosure, the massive lion was on his feet, his entire body trembling with what could only be described as excitement. His tail, usually held low in the characteristic manner of elderly lions conserving energy, was raised and twitching. His eyes, despite the cataracts that clouded them, were fixed with laser focus on Margaret. And then Margaret came into his direct line of sight. The effect was instantaneous and undeniable. Aslan exploded into motion with a speed and agility that shocked everyone present. For a 31-year-old lion with documented arthritis in his hips and shoulders, he moved like an animal a fraction of his age. He ran to the front of the enclosure, to the reinforced fence line that separated the viewing area from his habitat. And then he did something that made Sarah Chen's hand fly to her. Radio and Dr. Patel take an instinctive step back. Aslan reared up on his hind legs and placed his massive front paws against the fence. Not aggressively, not with the body language of a predator preparing to attack, but with the unmistakable posture of an animal trying to get closer to something it desperately wanted to reach. He was trying to get to Margaret, Margaret, for her part, seemed completely unconcerned by 25 pounds of lion pressing against a fence 15 feet away. She was sobbing now, deep shaking sobs that racked her fragile frame. Her cane clattered to the ground, forgotten. She took one step forward, then another, her hands outstretched. "Aslan," she called out, her voice breaking. "Aslan, my sweet boy, it's Mama. It's Mama, baby. I came back. I'm so sorry I took so long, but Mama came back." The sound that came from Aslan then was something that would be described in news reports, in scientific papers, in documentary footage in the weeks to come. It was described as heartbreaking, as haunting, as the most emotionally affecting sound any of the witnesses had ever heard from an animal. It wasn't a roar or a growl or a chuff. It was almost a cry, a sound of pure, unrestrained emotion, a sound that said, "Across the barrier of species and language and 29 years of separation, I remember you. I never forgot you. Where have you been?" Dr. Patel made a decision in that moment that would probably cost him his job if it went wrong, that violated multiple sanctuary policies and state regulations, and that he would never ever regret for the rest of his life. "Sarah," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving the lion and the elderly woman, "open the gate." Sarah turned to stare at him. "Sir?" Dr. Patel looked at her directly. "There are 6 safety officers here with tranquilizer rifles. You and I both know that Lion has absolutely no intention of hurting that woman. And she's dying, Sarah. She has months, maybe weeks. I'm not going to make her spend what might be her last chance to keep a 29-year-old promise standing on the opposite side of a fence. Open the gate." The safety protocols for entering a large cat enclosure were extensive. Normally, the animal would be secured in a separate holding area before any human entered the habitat space. But there was no time for that. No way to lure Aslan away from the fence where he stood transfixed. Sarah Chen's hands were shaking as she pulled out her keys and moved to the secured access gate. Dr. Patel helped Margaret toward the entrance, supporting most of her weight as her legs threatened to give out. And then the gate swung open. Every safety officer raised their weapons to ready position. Every sanctuary staff member held their breath. And Margaret Rose Sullivan, 79 years old, dying of cancer, weighing maybe 110 pounds soaking wet, walked through the gate and into the enclosure with a 520-pound African lion. Aslan came to her immediately. There was no hesitation, no pause, no moment of assessment. He simply walked toward her with purpose and certainty, closing the 20 feet between them in seconds. And then, with a gentleness that defied his size and strength, with a tenderness that seemed impossible from an animal with claws 4 inches long and jaws powerful enough to crush bone, Aslan lowered his massive head and pressed it against Margaret's chest. Margaret's arms came up and wrapped around his neck, her fingers tangling in the thick mane that was now more white than gold. She buried her face in his fur and wept. "I'm sorry," she said over and over. "I'm so sorry, my boy. I should have come back sooner. I was scared. I was so scared you wouldn't remember me, that seeing me would hurt you more than help you. But I never stopped thinking about you, not for a single day, not for a single hour." Aslan responded by doing something that lions in the wild do only with pride members they have known their entire lives. He began grooming her. His massive tongue, rough as sandpaper, began carefully licking her face, her hair, her hands. It was a behavior of belonging, of family, of love. He was marking her with his scent, reclaiming her as his own after 29 years of absence. But more than that, he was comforting her. Every time her sobs grew more intense, his grooming would become even more gentle, his body pressing more firmly against hers to support her weight. Sarah Chen was crying openly now, her radio hanging forgotten in her hand. Around the perimeter, 3 of the 6 safety officers had lowered their weapons and were wiping their eyes. Dr. Patel was recording everything on his phone with shaking hands, knowing that what he was witnessing would be studied by animal behaviorists for decades to come. This wasn't just unusual animal behavior. This was a complete rewriting of scientific understanding about emotional capacity, memory, and bonding in large cats. Margaret spent 3 hours in that enclosure. At one point, Dr. Patel tried to suggest that she should rest, that the physical strain was too much for someone in her condition. Margaret refused. 3 hours, she said firmly, is nothing compared to 29 years. I'm not leaving until I've said everything I need to say. So she talked to Aslan. She told him about the 9 months she had cared for him, about waking every 3 hours through the night to feed him specially formulated milk from a bottle, about how he used to cry if she left the room, how he would only sleep if he could feel her heartbeat, about the stuffed lion toy he carried everywhere, about how he learned to be gentle after accidentally scratching her and seeing her pretend to cry in pain. She told him about her husband Robert, who had helped care for him, who had fallen in love with the lion cub despite initial protests that they couldn't possibly keep a wild animal in their home. About Robert's death 8 years ago and how she wished he could be here to see this reunion. She told him about her cancer diagnosis, about the fact that this would be their last time together on this earth, and then she told him the things she had needed to say for 29 years. "I didn't leave because I didn't love you," she whispered, her face pressed against his mane. "I left because I loved you too much to keep you in a world that wasn't meant for you. You needed space and other lions and a life that I couldn't give you. But you have to know that giving you up was the hardest thing I ever did. You have to know that you were and are and always will be my son. Not legally, not biologically, but in every way that matters, you are my son." And Aslan, who could not understand the words, but who understood everything, responded by doing something that made even the most skeptical witness believe in the power of interspecies love. He carefully maneuvered his body so that Margaret could lean against him fully, taking all her weight. Then he lowered himself to the ground, moving slowly to accommodate her, until they were both lying in the grass. And there, in the middle of his enclosure, surrounded by sanctuary staff and safety officers, the old lion and the dying woman curled up together the way they had done 29 years ago when he was small enough to sleep on her chest. The story of Margaret and Aslan exploded across the internet within 48 hours. Someone on the sanctuary staff, against policy but following their heart, had shared a short video clip. The footage was grainy, shot through a fence from a distance, but it clearly showed the elderly woman embracing the massive lion, showed his gentle grooming, showed the two of them lying together in the grass. The video was viewed 40 million times in the first week. It was picked up by every major news outlet. Good Morning America ran a segment. The BBC flew a crew from London. Animal Planet requested permission to do a documentary. Dr. James Whitmore, a professor of animal cognition at Stanford University and one of the world's leading experts on big cat behavior, watched the footage and stated publicly that it was the most significant documented case of long-term emotional bonding between a human and a large felid he had ever encountered in 40 years of research. Dr. Maria Gonzalez, a neuroscientist at MIT who specialized in memory formation, wrote an entire paper based on the case, arguing that it provided evidence for emotional memory pathways that were far more durable and complex than previously understood. But Margaret didn't care about any of that. She had kept her promise. That was all that mattered. In the weeks that followed, Margaret visited Aslan every single day that her health allowed. The sanctuary set up a small covered seating area inside his enclosure where she could rest. They brought in a comfortable chair and medical equipment for the inevitable days when she would need oxygen or IV pain medication. Dr. Patel personally cleared his schedule to be present for every visit, along with a rotating staff of safety officers who, after the first week, stopped bothering to keep their weapons at ready position. It became clear to everyone that the only danger in that enclosure was that everyone might cry themselves to dehydration. Aslan's entire demeanor changed during those weeks. The lion that had been described in reports as aloof, occasionally aggressive, and resistant to enrichment activities became engaged and alert. He ate regularly for the first time in months. His mobility seemed to improve as if the arthritis that had been plaguing him was being held at bay by pure willpower and purpose. He had his mother back. He was whole again. Margaret, too, seemed to defy her prognosis. Her oncologist, Dr. Patricia Yamamoto, couldn't explain it medically, but noted that Margaret's pain levels were dramatically lower during this period, that she required less medication, that she had more energy than she'd had in months. The human body, Dr. Yamamoto told a colleague, can do remarkable things when the spirit has a reason to fight. But both of them knew it couldn't last forever. On November 28th, Margaret woke up unable to get out of bed. The pain was too much, the weakness too profound. She called Dr. Patel from her home in Gresham at 6:47 in the morning, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think I can make it to the sanctuary today," she said, and the defeat in her voice was crushing. "I'm so sorry. I don't want him to wonder where I am." Dr. Patel didn't hesitate. "Give me 2 hours," he said. "Just 2 hours, Margaret. I promise you'll see him today." What Dr. Patel did next was probably illegal, definitely against every liability insurance policy the sanctuary held, and absolutely the right thing to do. He mobilized the entire sanctuary staff. They constructed a secure transport cage that could fit in the sanctuary's largest van. They called in every favor with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, with Animal Control, with the local police department. And at 10:15 a.m., on November 28th, a convoy of vehicles pulled up outside Margaret's small cottage in Gresham. Aslan, sedated just enough to make transport safe, but not enough to dull his awareness, made the 35-minute journey in the climate-controlled van. Margaret's neighbors came out of their houses to watch as the massive lion in his specialized transport cage was carefully moved into Margaret's backyard. The cage was positioned so that when the door opened, Aslan would be in a securely fenced area of Margaret's property. Margaret herself was brought outside in her bed, the hospital bed that hospice had delivered 3 days earlier. She was barely conscious, the pain medication making everything hazy, but when she heard that familiar chuffing sound, her eyes opened. "They brought him to me," she whispered to her daughter Jennifer, who had flown in from Boston 2 days earlier and was standing beside the bed holding her mother's hand. "They brought my boy to me." The reunion in Margaret's backyard was quieter than their first. Aslan, still slightly groggy from the light sedation, moved slowly from the transport cage into the fenced area. He oriented himself immediately, his clouded eyes finding Margaret on the bed just 20 feet away. He walked to her and simply laid down beside the bed as close as he could get, his head resting near her hand. Margaret's fingers found his mane and tangled there, the way they had done thousands of times when he was a cub, the way they had done dozens of times in the past 6 weeks. "Thank you," she whispered to Dr. Patel, who was standing nearby with tears streaming down his face. "Thank you for letting me keep my promise all the way to the end." Margaret Rose Sullivan died peacefully at 4:23 p.m. on November 28th. She died in her own backyard under a grey Oregon sky, with her daughter holding one hand and her fingers buried in the mane of the lion she had saved and loved 29 years earlier. When her hand went still, when the last breath left her body, Aslan knew immediately. He lifted his head and made a sound that every single person present would describe the same way in interviews afterward. It was a sound of grief, pure, unmistakable, devastating grief. It was the sound of a son who had just lost his mother. Dr. Patel had planned for this moment, as much as anyone could plan for something so unprecedented. They had a plan to carefully sedate Aslan and transport him back to the sanctuary within 30 minutes of Margaret's passing. But when the moment came, Dr. Patel made a different call. "Let him stay with her," he said quietly. "Let him have time to say goodbye. She gave him 9 months when he was dying. We can give him a few hours now that she is." Aslan stayed beside Margaret's body for 4 hours. He didn't move, didn't make another sound. He simply lay there with his head near her still hand, keeping vigil the way lions in the wild are known to do with deceased pride members. When they finally did transport him back to the sanctuary, he went quietly as if understanding that his purpose had been fulfilled. Aslan died in his sleep 7 weeks later, on January 18th. The official cause of death was kidney failure, complicated by advanced age. But Sarah Chen, who found him that morning during feeding rounds, knew the truth. She had worked with big cats long enough to recognize the difference between an animal that died fighting and one that simply chose to stop. Aslan hadn't been in distress. There were no signs of struggle, or pain. He had simply curled up in the exact same position he used to sleep in when Margaret visited, and he had quietly slipped away. The Portland Wildlife Sanctuary held a memorial service for both Margaret and Aslan on February 2nd. More than 3,000 people attended, including scientists who had studied the case, journalists who had covered the story, and countless individuals who had been moved by the footage of their reunion. Dr. James Whitmore gave a speech in which he stated that the Margaret Aslan case had fundamentally changed his understanding of consciousness and emotion in non-human animals. Dr. Maria Gonzalez presented preliminary findings from her research, suggesting that the emotional centers of the brain could create memory pathways far more durable than previously believed when the emotional content was sufficiently powerful. But the most impactful moment of the service came when Jennifer Sullivan, Margaret's daughter, read a passage from her mother's personal journal. The entry was dated June 15, 1996, the day after Margaret had brought Aslan to the sanctuary for the first time. "Today I left my heart at the wildlife sanctuary," Margaret had written in her careful script. "I know I did the right thing. I know Aslan will have a better life there than I could ever give him, but driving away while hearing him cry for me was the hardest thing I've ever done. I made him a promise before I left. I promised I would come back. I don't know if I'll be able to keep that promise. I don't know if it would be better for him if I didn't, but I need him to know somehow that I will love him every single day for the rest of my life, that he is and always will be my son. And if there is any way, in this life or the next, to make good on my promise, I will. I will come back to him." 29 years, Jennifer said, her voice breaking as she folded the journal entry and looked out at the assembled crowd. She waited 29 years, but she kept her promise. And he waited 29 years because he knew she would. The sanctuary installed a memorial stone near Aslan's enclosure, which has been left empty as a permanent tribute. The stone is made of Oregon granite and features 2 bronze plaques. One shows a photograph of Margaret as a young woman, holding a tiny lion cub. The other shows a photograph taken during their reunion, the elderly woman embracing the massive lion. Between the 2 plaques is an inscription that reads, "Margaret Rose, Sullivan 1945-2024, and Aslan 1995-2025. She promised to return. He waited every single one of those years. They taught us that love transcends time, that promises matter, and that the bonds we forge with those we save are eternal." In the months following the memorial service, the scientific community continued to study the case. Dr. Whitmore published a paper in the Journal of Comparative Psychology titled Long-Term Cross-Species Bonding, Evidence from the Sullivan-Aslan Case. Dr. Gonzalez collaborated with veterinary neurologists to examine the biological mechanisms that might explain such extended emotional memory in lions. But perhaps the most significant impact of the Margaret and Aslan story has been on public understanding of animal consciousness and emotion. The footage of their reunion has been viewed more than 200 million times across various platforms. It has been used in educational settings from elementary schools to university-level ethics courses. It has sparked conversations about how we treat animals in captivity, about what we owe to the creatures we bring into our lives, and about the nature of love itself. Because at its core, this isn't just a story about a woman and a lion. It's a story about the promises we make and whether we have the courage to keep them. It's about the love that persists even when we think we've moved on, even when we tell ourselves it's been too long, even when fear whispers that we're too late. Margaret spent 29 years carrying the weight of a broken promise. She spent 29 years believing that she had failed the creature she loved most in the world. But in the end, she found the courage to go back. And Aslan, against every scientific prediction, against all reasonable expectation, remembered and forgave and loved her with the same intensity as he had when he was a helpless cub in her arms. The question that everyone asks is how. How did Aslan remember Margaret after 29 years? How did the olfactory memory persist when every neurological model says it shouldn't have? How did the bond remain not just intact, but as powerful as the day it was formed? The scientific answers involve theories about neural plasticity, about the potential for emotional memories to be encoded differently than factual memories, about the possibility that early life bonding experiences create pathways in the brain that are simply more durable than we've previously understood. But there's another answer, one that can't be measured in a laboratory or proven with brain scans. It's the answer that everyone who witnessed that reunion knows in their bones. Some loves are simply too powerful to forget. Some bonds are written so deeply into the fabric of who we are that time and distance, and even the barriers of species cannot erase them. Margaret saved Aslan's life when he was dying. She gave him not just survival but love, comfort, security, belonging. She became his mother in every way that transcended biology. And Aslan, in turn, gave her a gift that she carried for the rest of her life. He taught her what unconditional love looks like. He taught her that the things we do for others, even when those others can't speak our language or understand our reasons, matter profoundly and eternally. The legacy of Margaret and Aslan continues to unfold. The Portland Wildlife Sanctuary has established the Sullivan-Aslan Foundation, dedicated to improving conditions for big cats in captivity and supporting research into animal cognition and welfare. Every year on November 28th, the anniversary of Margaret's death, the sanctuary holds an open memorial where visitors can pay their respects and learn about the importance of keeping promises, both to animals and to each other. Jennifer Sullivan has become an advocate for ethical wildlife rehabilitation and sanctuary practices. She speaks regularly about her mother's story and about the lessons it teaches regarding our responsibilities to the animals in our care. And somewhere in digital archives and on millions of phones and computers around the world, the footage remains. The footage of an elderly woman walking through a gate to embrace a massive lion. The footage of a dying woman keeping a 29-year-old promise. The footage of love that refused to die. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the promises you've made or the loves you've left behind, leave a comment below. Tell us about a promise you kept or one you wish you had kept. Tell us about an animal that changed your life or a bond that you thought time had erased, but that still lives in your heart. And if you believe, as Margaret and Aslan proved, that love truly does transcend time and species, and every obstacle we place in its path, hit that subscribe button. Because there are more stories like this one, stories that remind us what we are capable of when we choose love over fear, courage over convenience, and keeping our promises over protecting ourselves from pain. Margaret Rose Sullivan promised a dying lion cub that she would return, and 29 years later, with her own death approaching, she did. Aslan waited every single one of those years, never forgetting, never giving up hope. Together, they proved that the most powerful force in the universe isn't gravity or nuclear fusion or any of the things we can measure and quantify. It's love. It's the love that waits, the love that remembers, the love that, against all odds and all expectations, finds its way home. Hit like if you believe in promises kept and love that never dies. Subscribe if you want more stories that restore your faith in the power of connection. And share this with someone who needs to be reminded that it's never too late to keep a promise, to go back, to make things right. Because Margaret and Aslan taught us that the only thing worse than being afraid to return is living with the regret of never trying. She promised to return. It took 29 years, but the lion waited. And when she finally came back after all that time, after all that pain, after all those years of guilt and fear and longing, he remembered. He remembered everything. And in that moment, the promise was kept, the circle was complete, and two souls that had been separated by time and circumstance and fear were finally beautifully, heartbreakingly whole again.